Alright, welcome to Cooking from the Cave. I'm Chef Pete Truziak. Today we're going to be doing a roasted pork loin stuffed with portobello mushrooms, arugula, and quinoa, as well as, and we're going to serve that over some roasted spaghetti squash. We're going to start with what takes the longest, and that's going to be our spaghetti squash. Some hints on what I've done. I've cut the squash in half. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my spoon and I'm going to scoop out the inside. So anything that pulls away from the meat of the squash itself is going to be just discarded. Now the next step that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we, the way we roast this is we're going to cook it in the oven, but we're also going to steam it at the same time. And I'm going to steam it with some aromatics. I'm going to steam it with rosemary. So we'll put that in our roasting pan. Anywhere is really fine. 1 cup of water. And I'm going to just crack some pepper and a little bit of salt in there as well. And then at the end of the dish, when you're ready to serve this up, you really don't need to season this part of it anymore. You can just serve it right from the squash itself. Okay, so in the oven goes the squash. I have it set at 375. And we'll check it in about 30 to 35 minutes. While that's going, let's start on our stuffing for the roasted pork. We're going to first heat up our pan, get it going nice and hot, add a little bit of oil, followed by the shallots, the mushrooms, and finally the arugula. In this pan that I have in the back here, I have some chicken stock going, and what I'll do is, once that comes to a boil, I'll dump my quinoa in there, and quinoa is a very simple grain to cook. Takes about 10 minutes at most. You just stir it. It's going to absorb your stock or whatever liquid you're cooking in it. And from there, it kind of plumps up a little bit and it's nice and soft and tender. Okay, my pan's hot. And you want to start with a hot pan, a little bit of oil when you're cooking mushrooms. I add the shallots as an aromatic. I'm going to dump my mushrooms in here. And I've diced everything up so that when I go to stuff the pork loin, it's not going to be that difficult. They're small enough that when I put it in there, nothing's going to really get lodged in the side or anything like that, or make it difficult for me to stuff it. Once the mushroom's going, you're going to start to notice a lot of steam coming out of the pan. That steam is created by the water that's actually sucked in the mushrooms as they grow. So obviously it's going to release it as it cooks. Now is a good time to, one, make sure the mushrooms are layered out flat in the pan, so that they cook evenly, but also turn down your heat. Turn down to about medium. We'll keep an eye on this, and in probably about 5 to 10 minutes, the mushrooms will be cooked down, nice and brown, and then we can add our arugula to this, shut it off, and we can proceed with stuffing. In the back here, I have my chicken stock going. Now's our time to add our quinoa. Toss it in all together. Alright, so on our back burner we have our quinoa going. It's a 1-to-1 ratio of quinoa to liquid. In this case I'm using chicken stock. Bring it up to a boil, that chicken stock, add your quinoa, stir it around for 15 seconds, cover it, turn it down to low, and let it cook for somewhere between 15 to 25 minutes depending on the quinoa. Our stuffing is almost set. The last thing we want to do is add our arugula. A word about this is make sure you do chop it up before you add it, because when you go to slice the pork, and I'll show this later, you don't want it to come out all in one piece. So let's just rough chop this. This is fairly tender arugula. If you have very long stems or something like that, then I would say pull the stems out, but this is okay. There's our rough chop. We'll add it to our pan. We're now going to turn the heat down, completely off. I'm going to add a pinch of salt. Maybe 2 pinches of salt, some cracked pepper to this, and my quinoa is completely done now. It's been about 15 minutes. Remember, bring that to a boil, and then bring it down to simmer, cover it, and you're good to go. I want to add this now to our mushroom. Mixture. I'm going to give it a good stir. And although I'm going to use thyme on the outside of this pork loin, I want to add a little bit to the inside, and what's going to happen is it's going to, one, wilt down the arugula, release some of that thyme flavor into the mushrooms, and in the cooling process, if there is any extra liquid now, what's going to happen, it's going to get absorbed into the quinoa. I find the easiest way to do this is go ahead and get a parchment lined sheet tray if you can. Lay it out flat, and in about 5 minutes in the refrigerator, it's going to be ready to stuff the pork. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and stuff the pork. There's a few ways of doing this. I'm going to show you the easiest way and I think the most efficient way. You can get twine and try tying that all up, but this is definitely by far the easiest and best presentation when it comes to a stuffed item. The first thing is you want to get a fairly long knife, fairly skinny knife too, and you're going to insert the knife into the pork loin as far as you can without causing a tear or a hole. If you do, it's not the end of the world. I'm going to put the knife all the way in, and if you notice, I'll rotate the pork over and turn it over again, just to make sure the knife is not coming through on any side or anything like this. What this does is it creates a big pocket in the middle of the pork loin, and it makes it easier to stuff. Now once it's in there, I'm going to rotate the knife, and I'm going to kind of saw a little bit, and I'm going to pull it out. I now have my pocket, and now I can put my stuffing and fill the whole thing. The next thing that comes with this, the second key point after that long knife, is make sure you have a good spatula that you can, one goes in as far as the tip, and you're able to maneuver it. So at this point, we're going to get our stuffing out of our refrigerator, and we're going to start to stuff the pork. Stuffing has been in the refrigerator now for about 5 minutes. It's cooled down enough that we can work with. What we're going to do is we're going to take our stuffing and we're going to put this in the opening of it, and as I pierced the pork loin, I didn't cut the other end, so the stuffing will fill the entire inside of this pork and not fall out on either side. So I'll continue to do this. I'll start fairly small with it, and I'll press down that stuffing all the way till I reach the bottom. And I'll continue to do that until this is completely filled. Let me show you, let me turn this guy around. So the quinoa is all stuffed in there. I did have a little bit of a blowout. Don't worry about it. It happens to everybody. The next step is to coat this with your seasoning. Now what I like to do is I'll lay it down on a sheet tray, parchment paper again, spread out what I'm going to put on here. There's salt and pepper and some chopped thyme. Just rough chop it like I showed you with the arugula. And we're just going to roll this pork loin back and forth in here so that we get a nice even coat on this pork loin. And you're just going to bring it back and forth, and so you can really get it nice and well coated. You're going to move the parchment paper back and forth. Alright, after it's coated, let's sear it and then get it into the oven. Again, let's get that pan hot. Put a little bit of oil in that pan once it's hot. A key indicator with oil and a hot pan, make sure it moves across the bottom of it nice and easily. Coat the whole pan, and then you're ready. Get yourself some long tongs to work with. And if you do have a blowout, sear that side first. We'll let it sit on that one side for about a minute, and we'll continue to roll that pork loin in the pan so that all four sides are completely brown. Alright, so our pork loin has now been seared on all four sides. Get this nice, beautiful crust on it. Looks gorgeous. Let's get it in the oven so we can eat quick. I'm going to go ahead and drop it in the oven. It's going to go in there for roughly about 20 minutes. And we'll just check it after 20 minutes. I'll set my timer. But in the meantime, our squash is just about done. If it's soft on top, if you can see how it's giving, it's done. Remember, all that water steamed from the inside, so it's going to be extremely hot. Let's go ahead and let these guys sit off to the side. And I'm going to show you a real quick pan sauce for this pork loin while that pork is cooking in there. I use about 1 cup of white wine. This is a Chardonnay. Now we're going to deglaze the pan with that white wine. And I'm going to scrape all the bits that are in the bottom of the pan, so all the caramelized proteins that are stuck to that pan are now coming off with the white wine. We'll let that white wine reduce for about 20 seconds, so it'll get nice and tight in the pan. Do this over high heat. It works a lot easier that way. It's much faster. And then we'll follow it up with 1 cup of chicken stock. Let that reduce and just keep it warm on the stove till our pork loin is done. Our white wine is reduced. Go ahead and add our chicken stock. While we're doing that, we'll turn our heat down. This is a big pan. Pork loin was pretty large, so this will reduce nice and easy on a low heat. So when everything is timed perfectly, you're going to have a nice tight sauce for that pork. Alright, so our pork's been cooking for 20 minutes. Let's get it out of the oven. We'll let it rest. And when I mean rest, we'll literally just flip our cutting board over. And let it sit there for about 5 minutes before we go ahead and slice into it. Our sauce is going still, and our next step here is we're going to add about 1 tablespoon of butter. I'm going to swirl my pan around with that butter in it. It's going to slowly melt, and we can just take a whisk and help stir that around as well. And what we'll do is, once that's completely melted, we'll go ahead and strain it, and our sauce will be ready, and by that time, our pork loin can be sliced. Alright, our butter is melted. Smells wonderful. Let's go ahead and strain this sauce and move it into something a little bit easier, smaller saucepan. What separates most cooks from what you're getting in the restaurants. There's a lot of flavor that's left in that pan. We forget to use it. Deglaze it with a little bit of an acid, maybe even lemon juice if you don't have an open bottle of wine, and hit it with some stock, stir it up, and it's good to go. The next thing is the wonderful spaghetti squash that we cooked earlier. If you take a fork, regular dinner fork, and you pull that squash, you see how it pulls apart and it leaves these thin little pieces that looks like spaghetti. Now we're going to slice the pork loin. Make sure you cut it across the grain. The grain is going to run from the thicker end down to the tail end, and still cut it on the bias so that what you expose is this beautiful little nugget of quinoa stuffing as well as the protein itself. And I'll probably cut them at 1/2-inch increments. The meat's very tender right now. You can serve this family style. We have a special guest at our house tonight. Wonderful Aunt Barb is coming for dinner, so we'll do it probably family style. I'll hit it up with a little bit of the pan sauce that we made. Pour it over top. And you will have a wonderful, wonderful meal for your loved ones, friends, neighbors, you name it. Thanks for joining us at Cooking from the Cave. Hope to see you real soon.